So if you head into the gallery and select Crossing Stars, you'll see that Ciaconna has already been added onto the character roster, where we can almost see every part of her kit, including basic attacks, resonance skill, forte circuit, liberation, etc. So in today's video, I'm going to be using this information that we have about her to analyze her pull value so that you'll know what to expect when she officially drops in the game and the value that she can provide for your account. In case you're new here, the name is Senpai and I make videos that helps you improve in every aspect of Withering Waves, so be sure to leave a like and subscribe because it helps me out tremendously. Let's start off with her character archetype and her damage potential. Ciaconna is considered a sub-DPS buffer, so that means her main role in your team building is to buff your main DPS character and do damage at the same time. As for her damage capabilities, we have no idea how she will perform yet because the gallery only shows you her level 1 damage scaling. But to give you guys a rough idea of her scalings at level 10, all you need to do is to multiply the level 1 scaling by a factor of 2. This is a common trend for characters that we have in the game so far. If we use Jian for example, the scaling on his King Long mode stage 1 at level 1 is 32.95% times 8, and at level 10 it's 65.52% times 8. So if we do a small division, you can see that we get a factor of 1.988, which is almost equal to 2. You can verify with a lot of characters in the game and you'll see that it's a common relationship between a level 1 scaling and a level 10 damage scaling. Now, how does that affect Ciaconna in terms of damage output? If you look at our liberation scaling, you can see that it has a 553.5% multiplier. So if we multiply that by 2, we get a rough idea of her level 10 scaling, which will be around 1107%, which is quite huge. But the only downside is that it doesn't have a separate scaling that is similar to her forte circuit, so it'll most likely scale off liberation damage by default. Speaking of her forte circuit, it will deal 11 instances of damage, as you can see right here, with this part dealing the highest damage. And if we multiply that by 2, we get a rough idea of 315.9% damage scaling, which is decent, and since the name of the attack is called Heavy Attack Quadruple Downbeat, it'll most likely scale off heavy attack damage. Keep in mind that she also has a passive that increases her forte damage by 30%, so if you're able to roll some decent heavy attack substats on her echoes, she can do some pretty decent damage. Speaking of echoes, her best in slot will be the Gust of Walking to support Aero damage dealers, or Moonlit that will make her universal, especially when you're only depending on her ability to apply Spectro Frazzle, which will be very beneficial to your team building, but we'll get into that very soon. Her resonance skill does not have a decent scaling, so it'll mostly be for regenerating resonance energy and applying Aero Erosion. Now you can see that her two main damage sources, which are the Liberation and Forte circuit, has different scalings, so building Ciaconna to improve her personal damage can be a bit difficult because if you compare her to other characters that fit her sub-DPS buffer role, like Cheji, you'll only need to focus on getting basic attack damage substats, unlike Ciaconna, where your focus is now split between liberation damage bonus and heavy attack damage bonus. But this won't be a problem for those who will be going for S0 because her true value for your account is her buffing and supportive capabilities through the application of Spectro Frazzle, Aero Erosion damage amplification, and lastly the provision of Aero damage bonus. So let's analyze those abilities into detail. Her basic attack has 4 stages and completing them will apply 1 stack of Aero Erosion. For those who do not know how Aero Erosion looks like or works, the Nightmare Monkey boss and the normal one apply some on your characters when they do damage to them. Essentially how Aero Erosion works is that it'll do damage over time to the inflicted target, and in this example that I'm showing you right here, it's going to be your characters to be specific. The damage over time happens at every 3 seconds, and the maximum stacks that you can have on the target is 3. The damage dealt is equivalent to the number of stacks that you have on the target. So in this example, maximum of 3 stacks was doing 1154 damage, and 1 stack was doing 231 damage to my character. The only difference between Aero Erosion and Spectro Frazzle is that with Aero Erosion, the maximum stacks you have on the target disappears, after the duration in which the maximum Aero Erosion stacks can persist on the target, which is 15 seconds in total. But with Spectro Frazzle, the stacks decreases every 3 seconds and deals the corresponding damage per the number of stacks that you have on the enemy. So this means that Spectro Frazzle can persist on enemies for a longer period of time per the number of stacks that you have on the enemy, compared to Aero Erosion, which doesn't really care how much stacks that you have on the enemy and will be removed after the 15 seconds duration if you stopped applying any onto the target. Now that a brief explanation of the current negative status that we have in the game is out of the way, let's see how Ciaconna can consistently maintain Aero Erosion and Spectro Frazzle stacks long enough on enemies in case DPS characters need them to do damage, like Pheobe in her Absolution state and Zani. An intro skill, basic attack stage 4, resonance skill, and forte circuit will apply 1 Aero Erosion respectively. So even without her liberation, you can consistently maintain the maximum Aero Erosion on the enemy by basically spamming your basic attacks to regenerate forte stacks after using her skill and forte circuit until you have enough concerto energy to use her liberation to end her field time and intro to another character like your DPS, for example. Speaking of liberation, upon activation, Ciaconna will enter a state where she will be able to inflict both Spectro Frazzle and Aero Erosion depending on the negative status effects that you selected, as you guys can see right here. So you basically select the stack that you want and it will be applied on the enemies over time. But if you don't select any stack that you want, switching to another character will apply Aero Erosion stacks over time by default. It's not stated in a kit description the duration between every application of Spectro Frazzle or Aero Erosion when our liberation state is active, but from the footage in the live stream, Aero Erosion and Spectro Frazzle can be applied every 2 seconds, so let's assume that that's how the mechanic will work when she's finally in the game. If you look at the skill detail of her liberation, you can see that this is the damage dealt when an Aero Erosion or Spectro Frazzle stack gets applied on the enemy, and this is the number of times that it can happen. So that means that she can apply a maximum of 20 Aero Erosion or Spectro Frazzle stacks, and since every stack activation has roughly 2 seconds cooldown, it means that it will take around 40 seconds before she will finish her performance to apply all the 20 Aero Erosion or Spectro Frazzle stacks. But do keep in mind that the cooldown between every single stack application might change when she's finally introduced in the game, but for now, the live stream footage is what we're working with. Now, with all these information in mind, we can clearly see that DPS characters in the future that'll rely on Aero Erosion to do damage by either consuming them to build separate stacks or just having them applied on enemies for damage increase will not be a problem when paired with Ciaconna, because her field time for doing damage combined with her liberation will be more than enough to provide a decent supply of Aero Erosion. However, Spectro Frazzle is a different issue since it's locked behind her liberation, so when pairing her with characters that need them like Zani, you can prioritize using her liberation at the start of your rotations so that by the time that you intro to Zani, you'll have enough stacks built up to fill her Blaze Forte bar. However, you may encounter issues in your second and third rotations. In the first rotation, everyone starts off with 0 concerto energy in the Tower of Adversity, for example, but with subsequent rotations, all your characters gain 10 concerto energy from intro skills. So if you're using Ciaconna with Zani, for example, by the time that you intro back to Zani, it's possible that her blaze stacks will not be fully charged by then due to your rotations in the subsequent rotations being faster than the first rotation. But this is not an issue since Zani can continuously regenerate blaze even after her liberation state is activated, as long as the enemies stay in Ciaconna's range for applying Spectro Frazzle stacks. It's also worth mentioning that if your Ciaconna and Zani rotations are well executed, it'll be much easier than the Zani Spectro Rover team, since Zani will be able to get more blaze stacks within a short period of time compared to the Zani and Spectro Rover team that demands quick swapping to achieve the best results. But I'll have to do more testing when Ciaconna is officially released in the game to figure out how her Zani team will perform compared to the Zani Rover quick swap team. For Pheobe, it'll be very easy since she only needs Spectro Frazzle applied on enemies to increase her damage output, so you can just rotate your team normally as you will do by staying on one character at a time, like from your healing buffer to your sub DPS, and finally your main DPS. But for a higher damage output overall, you're better off using Spectro Rover with Pheobe due to Rover's ability to shred spectral resistance. Now that we've understood how her negative status application can be good for existing characters, let's get into her buffing capabilities. Ciacconna's outro skill amplifies Aero Erosion by 100% for 30 seconds, but currently we do not have any character that scales off Aero Erosion damage, so this outro skill is useless at the moment. However, when you check her normal attack description, you can see that when Ciaconna starts a solo concert, which she can do at the end of her 4th basic attack, or by casting her Liberation, it grants a 24% aero damage bonus to the entire team. The DPS characters that can potentially benefit from this buff include Jian and Alto, but it's not a viable team composition. Even if she's running the Gust of Walking set, that grants additional 15% aero damage bonus to the entire team. Jian already has access to Mortefi, who provides heavy attack damage amplification, and damage amplification effects increases your damage quite significantly since they have their own separate multiplier, unlike aero damage bonus, which you can easily find on echo sets like Sierra Gale, that adds up to skill damage bonuses like heavy attack damage bonus, which you can also find on substats to form one multiplier. So basically all I'm trying to say is that damage amplification effects should always be much higher on your stats priority list when building your characters or forming their best teams if you can get them from outro skills and weapons. That's why Jian and Alto are not the best to pair with Ciaconna, since Mortefi exists for Jian and Sanwa's outro that amplifies basic attack is also the best in slot for Alto at the current state of the game. The last utility left to cover is Ciaconna's Forte circuit that has crowd control capabilities. From the live stream, we saw that using a heavy attack with full Forte stacks creates a vortex that pulls everything to the center, and it lasts for 3 seconds. This can be beneficial in Whimpering Waste, but do keep in mind that not all enemies in Wiwa can be grouped or crowd controlled, so it'll mostly work on 1-cost echo type enemies. That's why it's much better to have characters that deals damage in a large area of effect instead, to demolish all types of enemies within a short period of time. So in terms of pull value, her crowd control capability should be lower on the things that you have to consider before pulling for her. Now, with all the information unpacked in this video, here are my pull recommendations. Ciaconna is without a doubt a must pull character due to the simple fact that she is currently the only character that can apply Aero Erosion for future DPS characters that will need them. And considering the fact that negative status effects are now a core mechanic of the game, most characters released in the future have a high chance of scaling off one of them, so it's better to get your hands on sub DPS buffers like Ciaconna that can apply them on enemies so that you're at least guaranteed a decent sub DPS buffer for any character that depends on Aero Erosion. For aero damage dealers in the future that may not require negative status effects for doing damage, Ciaconna can be a decent alternative for that Aero DPS character in case you don't have their best sub DPS buffer that caters for all their needs. So using Jian as an example, Ciaconna is undoubtedly his second best in slot sub DPS to provide a total of 39% aero damage bonus for Jian when she's using the Gust of Walking Sonata effect. Her S2 further increases her viability with aero damage dealers that don't depend on negative status effects, since it provides a 40% aero damage bonus when she uses her Liberation. So Ciaconna is by no means stuck with aero damage dealers that requires Aero Erosion to do damage, further increasing her pull value since she has a bit of versatility due to her ability to buff aero damage bonus. So she can potentially help you save money in the future if you cannot afford to pull for the best in slot sub DPS buffers for aero damage dealers that don't require Aero Erosion to do damage. That'll be all for my Ciaconna pull value analysis. Hope this video provided value to you, and if it did, leave a like and subscribe to help support the channel because it's free and you can always change your mind. Be sure to also join our community Discord if you're having any issues with the game or you just want a place to chill or hang out. Link will be in the channel description. Catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.